I've been driving trucks for a little over 8 years now, and during that time I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road. Truck stops and rest areas, especially late at night, can get pretty eerie, but I always figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. That is, until one night about a year ago when I found myself at an abandoned rest stop off I-70 in Colorado, somewhere between Denver and the Utah state line. What happened that night still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. It was the middle of January and I was on a long haul from Chicago to Las Vegas, hauling a load of construction equipment. The weather was awful. Snow coming down in thick sheets, and the roads were starting to get slick. I'm no stranger to driving in bad weather, but something about this storm was different. It was that kind of heavy snow where your headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the world around you just seems to disappear into a white blur. I'd been driving for about 10 hours straight and was starting to feel the exhaustion creeping in. My eyes were getting heavy, and my body ached from sitting in the same position for so long. I knew I needed to find a place to pull over for the night, but I hadn't passed a decent rest stop in miles. I was keeping an eye out for anything, a gas station, a truck stop, even a wide enough shoulder to pull off onto. But the snow was making it hard to see, and the few signs I did pass were covered in ice, impossible to read. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving through the blizzard, I saw a sign for a rest area a few miles ahead. It wasn't one I'd ever stopped at before, but at this point I didn't care. I just needed to get off the road and get some rest before I ended up in a ditch. When I finally reached the rest area, I could tell right away that it wasn't exactly the most well-maintained spot. The entrance was barely plowed, and the parking lot was covered in a thick layer of snow. The few lights that were still working flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the empty lot. There were only 2 other vehicles there, an old beat-up sedan and a rusted-out pickup truck, both covered in snow and looking like they hadn't been moved in days. The place had a deserted, almost forgotten feel to it, but I figured it would do for the night. I pulled my rig into a spot near the edge of the lot, away from the other vehicles, and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind howling through the trees that surrounded the rest area. I sat there for a moment, letting the engine ticks and creaks fade away, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. After a few minutes, I decided to get out and stretch my legs. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the cold. The air was biting, the kind of cold that cuts right through your clothes and sinks into your bones. I zipped up my jacket and pulled my hat down over my ears, then started walking toward the restroom building on the other side of the lot. The building was a small concrete structure, typical of older rest stops. It had clearly seen better days. Cracks ran down the walls, and the windows were either broken or covered in grime. As I got closer, I noticed a strange smell in the air. It was faint, but unmistakable, like something rotting. I stopped in my tracks, shining my flashlight toward the building, but all I could see was the snow-covered ground and the darkened windows. I should have turned around and gone back to my truck right then and there, but I was too tired to think straight. I just wanted to use the bathroom and get back to the warmth of my cab. So I pushed the smell out of my mind and kept walking, my boots crunching in the snow as I made my way to the entrance. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing off the tile walls inside. The interior was even worse than the outside, dim, dirty, and freezing cold. The smell was stronger here, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn. I shone my flashlight around the room, but there was no sign of anyone, just cracked tiles, peeling paint, and a couple of broken sinks. The mirrors above the sinks were so filthy that they barely reflected any light. I made my way to one of the stalls at the back of the restroom, the smell growing stronger with each step. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, my flashlight flickered, casting weird shadows across the walls. I froze when I saw what was inside. The stall was empty, but the floor was stained with something dark, blood, or at least it looked like blood. It was smeared across the tiles in uneven streaks, leading to a drain in the center of the floor. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. My first thought was that maybe it was just old, that someone had gotten hurt here a long time ago, but the smell told me otherwise. It was fresh. I backed out of the stall, my mind racing. This wasn't right. Something bad had happened here, and I had no intention of sticking around to find out what. I turned to leave, but as I did, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving across the wall. I swung my flashlight around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty restroom, the wind howling outside. My breath was coming in short, sharp gasps, the cold air burning my lungs. I needed to get out of there now. I rushed back to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a faint sound behind me, like footsteps on the tiles. I whipped around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. The restroom was still empty, but I knew what I'd heard. Someone or something was in there with me. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I yanked the door open and bolted out into the cold night, the wind nearly knocking me off my feet as I stumbled through the snow back to my truck. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fumbled with my keys, trying to get the door open. When I finally managed to get inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I sat there for a moment just trying to catch my breath, but my mind was racing. What the hell had I just seen? Was someone hurt? Or worse? I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't want to find out. I grabbed my phone and thought about calling the cops, but something stopped me. What was I going to tell them? That I found some blood in a restroom at a rundown rest stop in the middle of nowhere? That I heard footsteps but didn't see anyone? They'd probably think I was crazy, or worse, that I was the one who did something. So I just sat there, my mind spinning, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. After a few minutes, I started my truck back up and decided to get the hell out of there. I didn't care how tired I was. I'd rather risk driving through the blizzard than stay at that rest stop for another second. As I pulled out of the lot, my headlights swept across the parking lot, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone standing near the edge of the trees. Just a dark figure, barely visible through the snow. But when I looked again, there was nothing there, just the wind and the snow swirling around in the darkness. I floored the gas and got back on the highway. The rest stopped disappearing in my rearview mirror. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes scanning the road ahead for any sign of trouble. But the storm was relentless, the snow coming down harder now, making it nearly impossible to see. I drove for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing in on all sides, the wind howling around the cab of my truck. Every so often I'd glance in the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of highway and the snow-covered landscape. Finally, I saw the lights of a small town up ahead, a welcome sight after miles of nothing but darkness and snow. I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of town, the bright lights and the sound of cars passing by a stark contrast to the desolation of the rest stop. I parked the truck and went inside to grab a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the lingering unease from what had happened. The clerk behind the counter gave me a strange look when I walked in, probably because I looked like I'd seen a ghost, but I didn't care. I just needed something to keep me awake for the rest of the drive. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about what I'd seen back at the rest stop. The blood, the shadow, the footsteps. It all seemed so surreal, like something out of a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something had happened there. Something bad, and I had the sickening feeling that I'd narrowly avoided becoming a part of it. I finished my coffee and got back on the road, the lights of the town fading into the distance as I headed west. The storm was finally starting to let up, the snow falling in light flurries instead of the heavy sheets from earlier. But the unease from that night stayed with me for the rest of the trip. When I finally reached Las Vegas, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pinkish glow over the city. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. but I still couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I dropped off the load and headed to a motel. For a while, I managed to do just that. I got back on the road, took on new hauls, and tried to forget about that night at the rest stop. But the memories never really went away. A few months later, I was driving through Colorado again, and out of curiosity, I decided to take the same route I'd driven that night. The weather was much better this time, clear skies and dry roads, and as I got closer to where the rest stop should have been, I kept an eye out for it. But when I reached the spot, there was nothing there. No sign, no turnoff, nothing. It was like the rest stop had never existed. I drove back and forth along that stretch of highway a couple of times, just to make sure I wasn't imagining things, but there was no trace of it. The snow from that night had long since melted, leaving nothing behind but empty fields and the open road. I don't know what to make of it. Maybe the rest stop had been closed down and demolished, or maybe it was never really there in the first place. All I know is that something happened that night, something I can't explain, and it still haunts me to this day. It was late summer, and I had just picked up a haul from Los Angeles, heading to Phoenix. The load was a sealed container, nothing out of the ordinary. The instructions were straightforward: just transport it across state lines and drop it off at a warehouse in Phoenix. I was pretty used to these kinds of jobs. Usually it was some kind of high-value cargo, so it was standard protocol not to mess with the container. No questions asked. I've always been good at following orders, so I didn't think much of it when the dispatcher emphasized not to open the container under any circumstances. I started my trip in the evening, hoping to avoid the LA traffic. Everything was pretty smooth at first. The highways were quiet, and I was making good time. But something was gnawing at me. Maybe it was just the monotony of the drive, or maybe it was the fact that the dispatcher seemed almost too insistent about the container staying sealed. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the curiosity kept bubbling up. What could possibly be in there that required so much secrecy? By the time I hit the desert stretches of I-10, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a deep, dark blue. There's something eerie about driving through the desert at night. The landscape is so barren, and the darkness feels even more oppressive with nothing around for miles. You feel like you're the only person left on Earth. I decided to pull over at a rest stop near Blythe to stretch my legs and take a break. This particular rest stop was one I'd used before. Nothing special, just a couple of vending machines, some bathrooms, and a few picnic tables. It wasn't particularly well lit, but that was typical for these kinds of places out in the middle of nowhere. I parked the truck in a corner, away from the few other vehicles that were there. As I got out of the cab, that nagging curiosity flared up again. I walked around to the back of the trailer and just stared at the container for what felt like forever. The desert night was dead quiet, the only sound being the distant hum of the highway. My mind was racing, filled with thoughts of what could be inside. It was probably the dumbest decision I've ever made, but I couldn't help myself. I checked around to make sure no one was watching and then pulled out a crowbar I kept in the cab. With a few quick motions, I pried open the seal on the container. My heart was pounding as I lifted the door just enough to peek inside. The light from my truck's parking lights barely reached into the container, but what I saw made my blood run cold. Inside, there were several people, men and women, bound and gagged, unconscious, or maybe just pretending to be. They were lying in rows, packed tightly together like sardines. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't just a bad situation, it was horrifying. My mind went blank, and for a few seconds I just stood there, staring. Then the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. This was human trafficking. I felt sick to my stomach. I slammed the door shut and resealed it as quickly as I could, my hands shaking the entire time. What the hell had I just gotten myself into? I knew I couldn't just leave these people in there, but I also knew I couldn't let whoever was responsible find out that I'd seen them. I ran back to the cab and grabbed my phone, my hand still trembling as I dialed 911. I couldn't risk giving them my location, so I just called in an anonymous tip and hung up. My head was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. I got back in the truck and just sat there, staring out at the darkness, trying to calm myself down. My heart was still racing, and all I could think about was those people in the back of the trailer. I felt so helpless. I wanted to help them, but I knew that getting involved any further would only make things worse. I kept telling myself that I did the right thing by calling the cops, but it didn't feel right at all. I stayed at that rest stop for what felt like hours, though it was probably only about 30 minutes. Eventually, I pulled myself together enough to start driving again. I couldn't afford to stick around any longer. I had to keep moving, get to Phoenix, drop off the load, and just try to forget this ever happened. But as I pulled back onto the highway, I noticed something that made my heart sink even further. There was a note tucked under my windshield wiper. It was a simple piece of paper, folded neatly in half. I didn't want to stop again, so I waited until I was a few miles down the road before I pulled over to the shoulder and got out to grab it. My hands were still shaking as I unfolded the paper. The note was short, just a few words scrawled in dark ink. "We know you looked. Don't think you can hide." My blood turned to ice. Whoever had written this note had to have been at the rest stop with me. They must have been watching me the entire time, and I never even noticed. Panic set in. I scanned the road around me, but there were no other vehicles in sight. It was just me, alone in the desert with a trailer full of trafficked people and the knowledge that someone was watching my every move. I crumpled the note and threw it on the passenger seat, then gunned the engine and started driving again, faster than I probably should have. My mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts. Who were these people? How did they know I looked inside the container? What were they going to do to me? As the miles ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my gut. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see a car tailing me or some shadowy figure lurking in the distance. But there was nothing, just the dark highway stretching out in front of me, endless and empty. I reached Phoenix in the early hours of the morning, exhausted and jittery. The warehouse I was supposed to drop off the container at was in an industrial area on the outskirts of the city. It was a nondescript building, surrounded by a chain-link fence with barbed wire on top. As I pulled up to the gate, a man stepped out of the shadows and motioned for me to stop. He was dressed in a dark jacket and jeans with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. I couldn't see his face clearly, but there was something about him that set off alarm bells in my head. He didn't say anything as he walked up to the cab, just handed me a clipboard with some paperwork to sign. I could feel his eyes on me the entire time, like he was sizing me up. My hands were still shaking as I scribbled my name on the line and handed the clipboard back to him. He nodded, then pointed to a spot near the loading dock where I could park the truck. I backed the truck into the spot, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. As I shut off the engine, I saw a few more men emerge from the warehouse, all dressed similarly to the first guy. They moved quickly, efficiently, heading straight for the container. I didn't stick around to see what they were going to do. I grabbed my bag, climbed out of the cab, and walked away as fast as I could without looking back. I didn't feel safe until I was in a motel on the other side of town, the door locked and bolted behind me. I sat on the bed, staring at the TV without really seeing it, my mind still replaying everything that had happened. I couldn't believe I just handed over a trailer full of human beings to God knows who. I wanted to call the cops again, to do something, anything, but I was too scared. These people knew who I was, knew that I'd looked inside the container. They'd already left me a warning, and I had no doubt they'd make good on it if I crossed them. The next few days were a blur. I tried to go about my usual routine, picking up new hauls and getting back on the road, but I couldn't shake the fear that had taken root in my mind. Every time I saw a black car or a man in a dark jacket, my heart would skip a beat and I'd start to panic. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything other than what I'd seen in that container and the note on my windshield. I never heard anything more about the container or the people inside it. I kept my mouth shut, didn't talk to anyone about it, not even my fellow truckers. It was like a bad dream that I couldn't wake up from. I just kept driving, trying to put as much distance between me and that night as possible. It's been 3 years since that night, and I'm still driving, still trying to outrun the memories, but they always catch up to me. I've spent 12 years behind the wheel on long-haul journeys, encountering a myriad of sights and sounds along the way. Most of it you just brush off, tell yourself it's part of the job, and keep moving. But there's one experience I had about 1.5 years ago that I can't seem to shake. It still sits heavy in my gut every time I think about it. I was on a run from Salt Lake City down to Los Angeles. It was a route I'd done dozens of times before. Nothing special, just a straightforward haul of refrigerated goods. The route takes you down I-15, through the desert and mountains, and it's usually a pretty easy drive. This time, though, something about it felt off from the start. I'd left Salt Lake in the early afternoon, planning to drive straight through the night to avoid the heat. It was late September, so the weather wasn't too bad, but it was still warm enough during the day that I didn't want to be stuck in traffic in Vegas or anywhere else along the way. I figured if I pushed through, I could get to LA by morning, unload, and catch some sleep before picking up my next load. Everything was going fine until I hit the stretch of highway just past Mesquite, Nevada. It was around 1 a.m., and the road was practically deserted. Just me, the hum of the engine, and the dark desert stretching out on either side. I was listening to the radio, trying to keep myself awake when my phone rang. It was a call from dispatch. Now, getting a call that late isn't unusual, but something about it didn't sit right with me. My dispatcher, Tom, was a no-nonsense kind of guy. He handled the logistics, gave me my routes, and left me alone unless something was really important. I picked up the phone, half expecting him to tell me there was a change in plans or something, but what struck me right away was the tone of his voice. It was off, kind of flat, almost mechanical. He gave me a new address for the delivery, said there was a last-minute change, and that I needed to reroute immediately. The new address was somewhere in North Las Vegas, in an industrial area I wasn't too familiar with. The whole thing felt strange, but I didn't question it at the time. I just wanted to get the job done and get some sleep. I plugged the address into my GPS, and sure enough, it took me off I-15 at the next exit, routing me through some back roads that wound around the outskirts of Vegas. The area was mostly empty warehouses and vacant lots, the kind of place that feels like it's been forgotten by time. As I drove, the streets got narrower, darker, and more run down. There were no other cars around, and the few streetlights that still worked barely cut through the darkness. When I finally reached the address, I found myself in front of a fenced-off lot with a dilapidated warehouse in the middle of it. The place looked abandoned. No lights, no signs, just a rusted gate hanging half open. I pulled up to the gate, the truck's headlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, and something in my gut told me to leave, but I ignored it. I figured maybe this was just some out-of-the-way place the company used for storage, and they hadn't bothered to keep it up. I'd delivered to sketchy locations before, and it usually turned out fine, so I convinced myself this was no different. I got out of the truck to open the gate, and that's when things started to get really weird. The gate was heavy, the kind that groans when you push it, and as I swung it open, I noticed something on the ground just inside the lot. At first, I thought it was just trash, maybe an old tarp or something, but as I got closer, I realized it was a blanket, stained dark with something that looked like oil. The smell hit me a second later, sharp and metallic, and I knew right away it wasn't oil. I stepped back, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw the drag marks leading from the blanket to the warehouse door. They were faint, almost washed away by the wind and dust, but they were there, clear as day. I felt a chill run through me, and for a moment, I just stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Everything in me was screaming to get back in the truck and leave, but I couldn't. I had a job to do, and the thought of not completing the delivery, of having to explain to Tom why I bailed, kept me rooted to the spot. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that maybe I was just imagining things. that the marks were nothing more than old tire tracks or something. So I pushed the gate the rest of the way open and drove the truck into the lot. The tires crunched over the gravel as I pulled up to the warehouse, and the sense of unease just kept growing. I parked the truck and cut the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the dark building in front of me, trying to gather the nerve to get out and finish the job. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. The wind had picked up, whistling through the broken windows of the warehouse, and I could hear something creaking inside, like an old door swinging on rusty hinges. I walked around to the back of the trailer, my boots crunching on the gravel, and started to unlock the doors. As I opened the trailer, my phone rang again, making me jump. It was another call from dispatch. I answered, expecting to hear Tom's voice, but this time it was a different dispatcher, a woman I didn't recognize. She sounded confused, asking where I was and why I wasn't on my original route. I told her about the call from Tom, about the new address, but she cut me off, telling me that Tom had been out sick for days, that he hadn't called anyone. The address she had on file for my delivery was the original one in downtown LA, not this place. I felt my stomach drop. The whole thing suddenly clicked. The strange tone in Tom's voice, the deserted warehouse, the drag marks on the ground. Someone had set me up. Someone who knew my route, knew the delivery details, and had sent me to this place for God knows what reason. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking, and immediately locked the trailer back up. I didn't care about the delivery anymore. I just needed to get out of there. I ran back to the cab, my heart pounding in my chest, and started the engine. The headlights flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the lot, and that's when I saw it. Movement in the corner of my eye. I turned, and in the dim light I could just make out a figure standing by the warehouse door, partially hidden in the shadows. It was too dark to see any details, but I could tell they were watching me. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body, but that was enough. I slammed the truck into reverse, the tires skidding on the gravel as I backed out of the lot as fast as I could. I didn't even bother closing the gate. I just floored it, speeding down the narrow streets, trying to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Who was that person? What were they planning to do? And how the hell did they know where I was supposed to be? I drove for what felt like hours, not daring to stop until I was back on the highway, surrounded by the safety of other cars and the bright lights of the city. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of Las Vegas that I finally pulled over at a truck stop, my hands still shaking as I shut off the engine. I sat there in the dark cab, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what could they do about it? I hadn't seen anything concrete, just a shadowy figure and some drag marks on the ground. There was no proof. Nothing that would hold up in any kind of investigation. So I did the only thing I could think of. I got back on the road and headed straight to LA. I didn't stop until I reached the original delivery address, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure from the warehouse standing behind me. When I finally made the delivery, I didn't say a word about what had happened. I just unloaded the goods, signed the paperwork, and got the hell out of there. I drove straight to a motel on the other side of the city, checked in, and locked myself in my room, not daring to leave until the next morning. It was about 2 years ago when this happened, but it still plays over in my head every time I get behind the wheel. I was on a run from Kansas City, Missouri, heading down to El Paso, Texas, hauling a load of auto parts. The route was pretty straightforward. Take I-35 down through Oklahoma, then catch I-10 west towards El Paso. It was the middle of summer, hot as hell even at night, and the air was thick with humidity. I remember feeling sticky and uncomfortable the whole time. The kind of heat that sticks to your skin and makes everything feel heavier. I was making good time cruising through rural Oklahoma when I hit a stretch of road that was more or less empty. It was just past midnight and the traffic had died down to almost nothing. It was one of those nights where the sky is so clear you can see every star, but the darkness around you feels endless, like you're driving through a black void. About halfway between Oklahoma City and the Texas border, I came across a roadblock. It wasn't the kind you see during construction with bright lights and cones. This was different. There were a few guys standing in the middle of the road wearing construction vests and holding stop signs. They waved me down, signaling for me to stop. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured there had been an accident or something and they were just directing traffic around it, but as I slowed down and got closer, something about the whole setup felt off. The guys didn't have any trucks or equipment with them, just the vests and the signs. The whole scene seemed a little too makeshift, like it had been thrown together at the last minute. I pulled the truck to a stop, rolled down my window, and one of the guys came up to the cab. He was tall and lanky, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't make much eye contact, which put me on edge right away. He told me that there was a bad accident up ahead, and the highway was closed. They were diverting traffic onto a detour that would take me around the closure and get me back on the highway a few miles down the road. I didn't have any reason to doubt him at the time, but something in the back of my mind was telling me to be careful. I'd never heard of this kind of detour before, where they didn't have any signs or lights up, just a couple of guys in vests. But I was tired, the night was dragging on, and I didn't want to waste time arguing. So I nodded, thanked him, and followed the directions he gave me. The detour took me down a narrow, two-lane road that wound through the countryside. There were no streetlights, just the high beams of my truck cutting through the darkness. The road was rough, with potholes and cracks that hadn't been maintained in years. I had to slow down to navigate the turns, which made the drive even longer. The further I went, the more uneasy I started to feel. The road kept getting narrower, and the trees on either side were closing in, their branches hanging low over the asphalt. I hadn't seen another vehicle since I left the highway, and the silence was unnerving. The only sound was the rumble of the engine and the crunch of gravel under my tires whenever I hit the shoulder. After about 20 minutes, I began to seriously question the route. I hadn't seen any signs or markers, nothing to indicate that this was a detour. It felt like I was driving deeper into the middle of nowhere, with no way to turn around. I was about to stop and pull out my map when I saw a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I felt relieved. Another vehicle meant I wasn't completely alone out here. But as the headlights got closer, that relief quickly turned to dread. The vehicle behind me wasn't passing. It was following, staying a consistent distance behind, just far enough that I couldn't make out any details. The road was empty enough that they could have passed me easily, but they didn't. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just another driver who got caught in the same detour. But the longer they stayed behind me, the more nervous I got. I started thinking about the guys back at the roadblock, how something about them hadn't seemed right. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what the hell was going on, but there were no answers, just more questions. Then, the road started to get even rougher. It wasn't just potholes anymore. The pavement was crumbling, giving way to dirt and rocks. The trees were thicker now, branches scraping against the sides of the truck as I drove. It was clear that this wasn't a detour, at least not an official one. I felt a surge of panic, but I knew I couldn't stop, not with that vehicle still trailing me. Up ahead, the road took a sharp turn, and I saw a glimmer of light through the trees. For a brief moment, I thought I might be nearing the highway again, but as I rounded the bend, my headlights illuminated a dead end. The road just stopped, turning into a mess of overgrown bushes and trees. There was no way forward, no sign of the highway, nothing. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just before the road disappeared into the underbrush. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I threw the truck into reverse, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. I needed to turn around, get out of there, find a way back to the highway. But as I started to back up, the headlights behind me flared, and the vehicle behind me sped up, closing the gap between us. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I could feel the fear rising in my throat, my hands shaking as I tried to keep the truck steady. There was no way I could turn around on that narrow road, not with them right behind me. I was trapped. Just as the vehicle behind me got too close for comfort, it came to a sudden stop. I could see it in my mirrors. A dark SUV, its lights glaring in the night. For a moment, everything was still, and I thought maybe they decided to let me go. But then, I saw the doors of the SUV swing open and a couple of men got out. They didn't say anything. They just started walking toward my truck, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see their faces in the darkness, but I could tell they weren't here to help. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I threw the truck into drive and gunned it, steering the rig off the road and into the trees. Branches snapped and scraped against the cab as I plowed through the underbrush, the truck bouncing over rocks and roots. I didn't care what happened to the trailer or the load. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between me and those guys as possible. I kept driving, the headlights of the SUV fading into the distance behind me. The truck was taking a beating, but it kept going, crashing through the trees until I found myself back on a narrow dirt path. I had no idea where I was, but I didn't stop. I followed the path, hoping it would lead me back to some kind of road, anywhere but where I'd just been. Eventually, the dirt path opened up onto a small rural highway. I don't know how long I drove before I finally saw signs of civilization again. A gas station, its lights a beacon in the darkness. I pulled in, my hands still shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat there in the cab for a long time, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My truck was scratched up, the trailer dented, and the load was probably ruined, but I didn't care. I was alive. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to figure out what I'd stumbled into, but I couldn't. It didn't make any sense. I sat there until I felt calm enough to drive again. Then I got back on the road, taking the most direct route to El Paso. I didn't stop until I reached the city, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. I was exhausted, my nerves shot, but I didn't care. I was just glad to be out of there. I made the delivery, dropped off the trailer, and checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. I spent the whole day trying to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those guys getting out of the SUV, walking toward me. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, somewhere, looking for me. After that, I avoided that route as much as possible, sticking to the main highways, even if it meant adding hours to my trips. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not my dispatcher, not my fellow drivers. I didn't want to relive it, didn't want to give it more power over me than it already had. It's been 2 years and I still don't know who those guys were or what they wanted. I've heard stories from other truckers about hijackings, robberies, even kidnappings, but nothing that quite matches what I went through. Maybe it was a setup, maybe they were looking to steal the truck, or maybe it was something worse. I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to. About a year ago, I was on a long haul from Chicago down to Albuquerque, New Mexico, with another driver named Joe. We'd been running together for a few years, usually in separate trucks, but on the same routes, keeping each other company over the radio during those endless stretches of highway. It was good to have someone to talk to out there in the middle of nowhere, especially when you're driving through the night. It makes the road seem less lonely, less endless. We left Chicago early in the morning, planning to drive straight through, only stopping for gas and a quick bite. We wanted to make good time, get to Albuquerque, unload, and grab some well-deserved rest before picking up our next loads. The first half of the trip was pretty uneventful, just miles and miles of highway, with the occasional small town breaking up the monotony. We kept each other awake with stupid jokes and stories, the usual banter that helps pass the time. We decided to stop for the night at a rest area somewhere in the Texas Panhandle. It was one of those places you only stop at because you're too tired to keep going. Nothing special, just a few parking spots, a bathroom, and some vending machines. The rest area was practically deserted, Just the two of us and maybe one other truck parked way down at the other end of the lot. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the concrete, and the whole place had that eerie, quiet feel to it, like the world had gone still. We parked our trucks side by side, and after checking the loads and locking everything up, we decided to crash for the night. Joe said he'd be up early, ready to hit the road by sunrise, and I figured I'd do the same. We both climbed into our cabs, exchanged a quick goodnight over the radio, and that was that. I've always been a light sleeper, especially when I'm on the road. Even in the cab, with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, I never really sleep deep. There's always a part of me that's on alert, listening for anything out of the ordinary. That night was no different. I tossed and turned for a while, trying to get comfortable, but something kept nagging at the back of my mind. I chalked it up to nerves and exhaustion, and eventually I drifted off. When I woke up, it was still dark. The clock on the dash said it was just past 3 a.m. I couldn't figure out what had woken me up, but I felt uneasy, like something was off. I sat up, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and looked out the window. The rest area was as quiet as it had been when we arrived. No lights, no movement, just the distant hum of the highway. I grabbed the radio to check in with Joe, but there was no response. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes he slept with the radio off, not wanting to be disturbed. I figured I'd let him sleep and try to get a few more hours myself. I lay back down, but the unease didn't go away. I kept thinking about how empty the rest area felt, how quiet it was. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Eventually, I gave up on sleep and decided to get out and stretch my legs. Maybe some fresh air would help clear my head. I slipped on my boots, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out of the cab. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the stuffy cab, but it was also heavy with that stillness, like the world was holding its breath. I walked around the truck, checking the locks and making sure everything was secure. When I got to the front, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Joe's truck wasn't there. The spot where he'd parked was empty, just a dark patch of asphalt where his rig had been. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he'd decided to get an early start and hadn't wanted to wake me, but that didn't make sense. He would have at least left a note or called me on the radio. And why would he leave in the middle of the night without saying anything? I grabbed the radio again, calling out to him, but all I got was static. I tried his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. That's when the unease turned to real fear. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. I started walking around the rest area, shining my flashlight into the shadows, looking for any sign of Joe or his truck, but there was nothing. No tire tracks, no footprints, nothing to indicate he'd even been there. It was like he'd just vanished into thin air. I went back to my truck, trying to think, trying to figure out what to do. I could call the cops, but what would I tell them? That my buddy had disappeared from a rest area in the middle of the night? They'd probably think we were playing some kind of prank, or that he'd just taken off without telling me. But I knew Joe. He wouldn't do that. Not without a damn good reason. I decided to wait until morning, hoping he'd show up or call, but the minutes dragged by and there was still no sign of him. The sky started to lighten, the first rays of dawn creeping over the horizon, but my unease only grew. I kept thinking about all the stories I'd heard from other drivers, about hijackings, robberies, and worse. But none of those seemed to fit what was happening here. Joe wasn't the type to get into trouble, and we were in the middle of nowhere. There was no reason for anyone to target us. As soon as it was light enough to see, I started searching the rest area more thoroughly, walking the perimeter, looking for anything I might have missed in the dark. I checked the bathrooms, the vending machines, even the dumpster at the far end of the lot, but there was nothing. It was like Joe and his truck had just been erased from existence. By mid-morning, I was out of ideas. I didn't know what else to do, so I got back in my truck and started driving. I figured I'd head to the nearest town, find a phone, and report Joe missing. Maybe someone had seen something, or maybe he'd turned up somewhere along the way. As I drove, I kept scanning the road looking for any sign of his truck, but there was nothing. Just miles and miles of empty highway stretching out in front of me. I felt like I was driving through a dream, like none of this was really happening. I reached a small town about an hour later and pulled into a gas station. I was about to go inside and use the phone when I saw a cop car parked at the far end of the lot. The officer was sitting in his car, filling out some paperwork or something. I walked over, trying to figure out how to explain what had happened. The officer listened patiently as I told him about Joe, about how we'd parked at the rest area together and how he'd disappeared during the night. He asked a few questions, took down some details, but I could tell he didn't really believe me. He said they'd keep an eye out for Joe's truck, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. He suggested I wait a day or two, see if Joe turned up on his own. I thanked him and got back in my truck, feeling more lost than ever. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I thought about going back to the rest area, but the idea of returning to that empty lot made my skin crawl. So I kept driving, heading towards Albuquerque, hoping against hope that Joe would show up somewhere along the way. The rest of the trip was a blur. I drove in a daze, barely paying attention to the road. Every time I passed a truck that looked even remotely like Joe's, my heart would skip a beat. But it was never him. Just other drivers going about their business, oblivious to the nightmare I was living. When I finally reached Albuquerque, I called the cops again. I gave them Joe's description, the details of his truck, but they didn't have anything new for me. No reports of a missing trucker, no sightings, nothing. It was like Joe had just disappeared off the face of the earth. I stayed in Albuquerque for a few days, hoping for some kind of news, but nothing ever came. Eventually, I had to get back on the road, pick up another load, keep moving. But I never stopped thinking about Joe, about what had happened that night at the rest area. It haunted me, that feeling of helplessness, of not knowing what had happened to him. I tried to put it behind me, to focus on the job, but it was always there, in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. Every time I stopped at a rest area or a truck stop, I'd find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see Joe's truck parked there waiting for me. But it never was. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.